Hey Power Platform friends, welcome back to another video. This is the second video in a series of videos I'm making about Power Platform Application Lifecycle Management, or ALM for short. In the first video in the series, I talked about what all the different ALM options are, and I compared and contrasted them. The next thing we're going to do is start diving into actually looking at what it looks like to do ALM with each one of the options I talked about. To do this, before we get started actually demonstrating them, I'd like to take you on a tour of the sample Power Platform solution that I created. Now, this solution was created to illustrate very common things we need to do in Power Platform ALM, like changing where a connection for a data source is pointing to, or getting an environment variable back to help us work as we go from one environment to another with our solution. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the sample solution that I've created, and then you'll be all armed up and understand it very in depth as we go forward and deploy it with all the different ALM approaches. So thanks again for watching. I hope you enjoy. As I mentioned, the goal of this video is to walk you through the sample solution that I have created. I'm going to use this same exact sample solution all throughout this entire video series. By doing that, it will give us the ability to see things in a very consistent fashion, no matter which approach we examine and demonstrate. So what's inside the sample solution that I've created? Well, as I mentioned, I designed it to illustrate all the common patterns associated with Power Platform application development and how that works with the Application Lifecycle Management we're talking about in this video series. I use this exact same sample solution throughout all the videos to promote consistency and make it easy for you to compare the ALM approaches against each other. So let's take a deeper look at the sample solution itself. Here is a screenshot of my sample solution. I have named it ALM Demo Solution. Notice there's no spaces in the name. So what does it contain? It contains one Canvas Power App. It also contains two flows. The first flow will create a SharePoint list item. The second flow will return the current environment. The current environment, how do I return that? Well, I created an environment variable to tell me which environment I'm in. You can see that in the list of environment variables. I have three environment variables in the solution. One of them indicates a SharePoint site. One of them indicates a SharePoint list within that site. And the other one, as I mentioned, is the current environment. Finally, we have a connection reference inside of this solution as well. The flow that creates a new SharePoint list item uses this connection reference to connect to the SharePoint list. So let's dive a little bit deeper here and take a look at the architecture under the hood. So the first thing I'd like to draw your attention to on the right here is two screenshots. The screenshot in the bottom right, as you can see, is a SharePoint site. I created a list inside of it called Power Platform ALM. My SharePoint site is named ALM-dev, and these are list items inside of that SharePoint list. I will be using this same list named Power Platform ALM throughout this entire video series, and this exact same Power App you see here that comes in the solution. So this is the Canvas app that I referred to. The Canvas app does a few different things. The first one it does is it displays the SharePoint list data in this gallery control that you can see here. The connection to this data that the gallery displays is defined in the Canvas app. It's a direct data connection to the SharePoint list. It's not fetched via flow, and it's not using data source environment variables. The reason I did not use them is I wanted to demonstrate how ALM works with the very common scenario where someone makes a direct connection to a SharePoint list from a Power App. There's another piece of the puzzle. The Canvas app also will invoke a flow to create a SharePoint list item and then return the new item's ID. And here you can see I put an arrow to the button that will allow me to do this. The flow that is invoked by this button, it uses a connection reference that I talked about when I went through the inventory, and the environment variables of the SharePoint site and the list to know how to connect to which SharePoint list, depending on which environment I deploy it to. So when I open the app, the code that populates this gallery automatically runs, and the gallery is populated. I can then click Create Item to make a new item in the SharePoint list and go to the SharePoint page and refresh it and validate it's there. And then I can click Get Items here, which just refreshes this data source in the gallery, and I can see the new item created. And we'll see that in a little bit here. So that's the second thing that we do. And so I chose this one because it's a very common pattern of invoking a flow that goes and interacts with SharePoint data. And so that's why we have that exact pattern happening here. Now the next thing that we're going to demonstrate here is how to get environment variables directly back into the Power App. And so in this example, I have a Canvas app that invokes another flow, and that flow will simply return an environment variable that tells me the current environment the app flow is running in right now. And why do I bring this up? Because I just showed a flow bringing data back. Why show a flow that brings environment variable back? Well, in this case, I think it's very important to consider for ALM. Because sometimes you may want to write code in your app that is intelligent enough to react differently depending on what environment it sits in. And I know for some things we can use environment variables and extrapolate away those things. Other times it may make sense to have a pattern where the code in the Power App makes a decision based on the environment you're in and executes a different code in the Power App. So that's why I'm putting this in here, is to help illustrate that this is possible and it's something you can think about as you architect Power App solutions. So all these things are in the app. This is what the sample solution contains. So what are we going to do with it? In this video series, I'm going to demonstrate a lot of different ALM use cases here. I couldn't find a good stock photo, so I put in a little picture of my Halo Infinite avatar there. I think it looks pretty cool. Anyway, back to Power Platform. These are the different most common ALM use cases that I demonstrate in this series. I'm going to show you how you can add a solution to source control. I'm going to show you how to export a solution from one environment and import it into another. I'll show you how to create connections, how to create environment variables and set their values, how to edit solution artifacts to use the proper connections and connection references in each environment. What do I mean by solution artifacts? I mean, how would I actually go in and edit a flow? For example, if I was using the manual ALM approach, I would need to edit a flow or a Power App, manually point it to another connection. And so a solution artifact in this case would be the Power App or the flow I was editing to manually dial in the proper connections. I'm also going to show you how to share Power Apps. This is very easy to do manual. You just click the button to share it and type in someone's email. But what if you want to automate it? Maybe as soon as you deploy the Power App, you'd like to share it with the test team, or share it with the team that is intended to use it. So I'll show you how to do that as well. And then finally, I'll show you how you can automate deleting solutions in your ALM. Because good cleanup and environment hygiene not only saves you money because you need less storage space and Dataverse storage space and capacity you have to pay for, but it just keeps things more organized and easier to do your work in when you're not confused about what's what. So now it's time to take a tour of the sample solution. So I'm going to now give you a demonstration of the functionality that this sample solution contains, that Power App and those flows I talked about, and then I'll tour you through the artifacts as well to get you comfortable with all the pieces of the puzzle here. Ultimately, it's very hard to compare ALM approaches against each other unless you really know what you're doing and trying to roll out. So I'm going to give you a really fine-tooth comb, very fine granular examination of the solution here, so you know all the pieces of the puzzle, because we're going to be referencing them all throughout the solution. before I dig into every nook and cranny of the solution, I'm going to take you on a demo and show you it in action so we can really see what it does. And then after we see it do that, we'll come back and see how it did it. So the first thing I'm pointing out here is here's our sample solution. ALM demo solution. You can see the inventory matches up with what I talked about before. Notice I'm in the default environment. So I'm either going to start in the default, or I have another one called the dev environment too. I will start there every time in this ALM series. And after we develop in default or dev, then we will push it up through QA, and then we'll move it to the production environment after that. Okay, so here we are. And in the sample solution, I'm just going to open up my Canvas app here. This is my demo ALM Canvas app. So I'm going to open this guy up and just run him. And when it runs, as I just mentioned earlier in the video, it's going to go run some code. It's going to connect to this SharePoint list we see right here. It's going to merely return the items from the SharePoint list and display them in the Power App. So as soon as our Power App loads up, we will see that data in there. There's nothing special about this list. It literally, to make it, I went create new list and then gave it the name Power Platform ALM. That's it. It came with the title column. I did not do anything to the title column, the schema, the settings, and as you can see, I added no more columns. I was trying to keep it as simple as possible so you can follow along in this video series if you wish to do the same thing. So now we come back to the Power App, and here we can see, here is that demo ALM SP list. Where does that come from? Right here. My direct connection to that site, as you can see, ALM-dev, and it's a SharePoint connection. There are no data source variables set up with this particular connection. Okay, so that's how we got the data in there, and we can see that that data matches. I also created a list item with the name of the environment so I can tell real quick if it's the right one. Okay, so what can the Power App do? Well, we saw it can query data. That's nice. Let's make a new item. So when I click Create Item, what happens is a flow runs, and that new item is created. Notice there's 2 at the date of 12/13 here today. I'm going to hit Get Items now, which is just refreshing that data source that was bound there. And here we can see the 3rd item that the flow just created. Everything's good. The next thing of functionality we can see is Get Current Environment. Notice there's nothing where my mouse is right now. Abracadabra. I just called a flow and I returned the environment variable I set to the value of default to indicate this environment, and I display it on the screen. I know everyone likes looking at the code. Let's go do it. So how did I do Create Item? Create Item is this flow, demo ALM create item flow.run. We'll bounce out of this app editor in a second and go look at it. Get items. All that is a refresh on this data source. Get current environment. Here I'm setting a global variable to empty string. And then after that, I set it to the return value of get current environment.run, and I have a property coming back called current environment. So that's how I get that value back. Then how is it displayed? Well, this global variable is used right there inside of that label to display it. So as you can see, super simple Power App, but very powerful from the point of view of it allows us to demonstrate all the different pieces we would need to wire up from an ALM concept. Okay, so let's leave our Power App now. We know how it works, and take a little bit of a look at these flows. So here's the first one, create item flow. And take a quick look at this guy. And inside of our create item flow, as I mentioned, we use a connection reference right here called demo ALM SP connection reference. That is the exact same name of the connection reference that the solution contains. Notice that we're also using 2 environment variables. I have demo ALM SP site and demo ALM SP list. When I bounce back out of this flow, you'll see them in the inventory of the solution after that. Then you can see for the title to create, I'm just doing UTC now. That's why it's just time stamping it. And then I respond to the Power App with the ID of the item that was created. Very simple how that one works. The other flow, return current environment. This is about as simple as it gets. When we look at this one and we put it in edit mode, you can see the only thing it does is return a value I named current environment, and there's my current environment variable. You can also see that one when I bounce back to the solution here in a second. So that's the flows. And now here are our environment variables that we just saw. They're my current environment, my SharePoint list, my SharePoint site. Notice the internal names for them has a prefix of can because my publisher starts with CAN in this environment. Now, if I'd like to look at the current values of these environment variables, I could click on them and look here, but my favorite way to see what really the value is to go to the environment variable value table. This is, you can find this table under Dataverse. So if I come into tables, you may go, oh, why don't I see it here? It's under all. After you go to all, you come down here, you can find the environment variable definitions, which defines an environment variable. It gives it the name, and then this is the value assigned to it. So then you can come in and look at the name. I like to then sort by this, and I can look for that can prefix, and there they are. So here are my real live values for these environments right now. I can see the current environment was default. Remember when I showed my SharePoint or my Power App and I hit the button to return the environment? That's why it returned this value right here. Here is my SharePoint list, the GUID for that, and here is the SharePoint site. We saw that URL right here. How did I get the GUID for this SharePoint list? It's pretty easy. You can come up here and go to list settings, and as soon as you go to list settings, after the %7b, that's where you go to, all the way to %7d. The %7b and %7d are just escape characters in their URL encoding. It evaluates to a squiggle if you would decode it. So that's that value right there, that 94 right there. So why did I use that? Why didn't I type in Power Platform ALM like my list name? Most things you will find are okay in Power Platform if you type in the list name, but some things aren't. They won't work. They will break unless you have the GUID for the list to identify it. I'll give you an example. If you have a flow that uses an HTTP request action to invoke the SharePoint API, depending on what you're trying to do with the SharePoint list API, you may need to pass in the GUID, because when you pass in the friendly name of the list, the API call will fail and tell you it can't find the list or give you a 401, something like that. So that's why you always put the GUID in there for your environment variables that reference lists, because they're pretty much foolproof and they work all the time with everything. Okay, so coming back to our solution, I think that's a tour of everything in here. Let's see, we looked at the environment variables. Let's examine the connection reference. Here you can see in the connection reference that we're just pointing to a connection that I have defined before. And we've already looked at the Power App and the flow. So now you know everything that is inside of this solution. And so now that we have a great tour of what's in here, the next video in my series is going to go through deploying this solution. And we're going to start with a manual approach. I'm going to take this solution from this default environment I have right here, and I'm going to move it up to my QA environment and show you all the steps along the way. All the things that you'll need to do to make the connections that the reference relies on, how you'll have to populate environment variables or variable values, and anything else that we need to do in a manual deployment. Then in the videos after that, I'm going to walk through the other options. How do we do it with DevOps? How do we do it with Power Pipelines? And then point you toward a lot of other great videos that show you how to do it with the ALM Accelerator Kit too. So thanks for watching this video in the series, and I hope it comes in very handy for you. I'll see you next time.